The plane was falling at 18,000 feet. The pilot had tried everything. Nothing worked. He whispered to his co-pilot, "We are going to die." But in the back of the cabin, a little girl quietly stood up. She was 9 years old. And she refused to let that happen. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The sky over the Rocky Mountains was a deep, quiet blue. It was early evening. The sun was just beginning to dip below the western peaks, painting the clouds in soft shades of orange and pink. From 18,000 feet up, the world below looked peaceful, just wide green valleys, dark mountain ridges, and tiny silver rivers catching the last light of the day. Flight 93B had reached its cruising altitude exactly on schedule. It was a mid-sized commercial aircraft, carrying 94 passengers and a crew of 6, flying its regular route from Phoenix, Arizona, to Seattle, Washington. The flight was expected to take 2 hours and 40 minutes. Everything about it, from the clear weather to the calm radio chatter, pointed toward a completely normal evening in the air. Inside the cabin, people were settling in. The seatbelt signs had clicked off just minutes ago. Passengers stretched their arms, opened their bags, and pulled out their headphones. Flight attendants moved smoothly through the aisles, beginning the drink service with warm smiles. A few children pressed their faces against the oval windows, watching the mountain tops pass far below. The low hum of the engines filled the cabin like a lullaby. Nobody on board had any reason to worry. Nobody, that is, except for a 9-year-old girl in seat 16C. Her name was Emma Caldwell. She was small for her age, with dark brown eyes that moved quickly and a habit of sitting with her legs tucked underneath her. While most children her age would have been watching cartoons on the seatback screen or playing games on a tablet, Emma was doing something very different. She had a laminated aircraft systems chart spread open across her lap, and she was reading it the way most people read a gripping novel, with total focus, her finger tracing the diagrams, her lips moving slightly as she memorized details. Beside her sat her mother, Dr. Sarah Caldwell, a registered trauma nurse who was returning home from a medical conference in Tucson. Sarah was a calm and sharp-minded woman who was used to working in emergencies. But even she found herself doing a quiet double-take at what her daughter was studying. "Still reading about planes, Em?" she asked softly, leaning over. Emma nodded without looking up. "The Boeing 737 has 2 separate control relay systems," she said quietly, as if reciting something from memory. "If the primary hydraulics fail, it switches to the backup. But if both lose power at the same time, you have to control the trim manually. Most pilots forget that under pressure." Sarah stared at her. "Where did you learn that?" "I read the full Boeing maintenance manual," Emma said simply. "And the pilot training handbook. And the FAA emergency procedures guide." Sarah opened her mouth, then closed it again. She had long accepted that her daughter was unusual. Emma had been reading technical documents since she was 6. She had memorized airport layouts, runway lengths, and aircraft schematics the way other children memorized song lyrics. But even knowing all of that, moments like this still made Sarah pause. Emma had never been in a cockpit. She had never held a control stick. But in her mind, she had flown every type of commercial aircraft dozens of times, running through simulations on her old laptop, studying emergency checklists, and quietly absorbing every detail she could find about how these machines worked. She simply loved planes. She always had. And love, when it is honest and deep, teaches you more than any classroom ever could. 25 rows ahead, inside the cockpit, Captain Douglas Harris was in good spirits. He had been flying commercial aircraft for 32 years. He had seen bad weather, tricky landings, nervous passengers, and equipment hiccups. He was known among his colleagues for staying calm when things got difficult. His co-pilot, First Officer Ryan Keller, was 15 years younger but equally experienced. The two of them had flown together many times. They worked well as a team. Harris was sipping his coffee and telling Keller a story about a rough landing he had made in Denver years ago, when everything changed. It started with a single yellow warning light on the main instrument panel. Then another. Then 3 more, all at once. The autopilot disconnected without any command from either pilot. The navigation display flickered and went red. And then, before Harris could even set down his coffee, the aircraft lurched violently to the left. Both pilots grabbed their control sticks at the same moment. "What the hell?" Keller said, his voice sharp and focused as he reached for the diagnostic screen. Harris was already working. His hands moved from muscle memory, 32 years of training taking over before his mind had time to think. He hit the manual override. He checked the backup systems. He tried to re-engage the autopilot. Nothing responded correctly. Back in the cabin, the plane's sudden yaw to the left had sent a tray of drinks flying across the aisle. Passengers gasped. Some grabbed the armrests of the seats in front of them. A woman near the back of the aircraft screamed. The overhead lights flickered once, dimmed, and then came back on at normal brightness. The flight attendants moved quickly into the aisle, using calm voices and steady hands to reassure passengers. "Just a little unexpected turbulence," one of them said to a frightened older man. "Everything is fine. Please keep your seatbelts on." But it was not turbulence. It was not even close to turbulence. In the cockpit, both pilots now understood the scale of what they were dealing with. The hydraulic relays that controlled the flight surfaces, the ailerons, the elevator, the rudder, had failed. Both of them. Simultaneously. The instrument panel was mostly dark. Key readouts were either frozen or giving wrong numbers. The radio panel had gone completely dead. They could not reach air traffic control. They could not send a distress signal. As far as the world below was concerned, Flight 93B was still flying normally at cruising altitude. Except it was not. The aircraft was descending. Slowly but steadily, without clearance, without control, and without anyone on the ground knowing it was happening. "We've lost both hydraulic relays. Instruments are blind. We're flying on instinct." Captain Douglas Harris, Flight 93B. The altimeter showed 17,500 feet. Then 17,100. The descent was quiet and gradual, which almost made it worse. A sudden drop feels like an emergency. A slow, steady one feels like something you might still be able to fix, right up until you cannot. Harris looked at Keller. Keller was staring at the backup electrical schematic, running through every system in his head, searching for something, anything, that made sense. But the combination of failures happening on this flight did not follow any pattern either of them had seen or been trained for. It was as if the aircraft's entire electrical nervous system had simply stopped speaking to itself. "Try cycling the auxiliary power unit," Keller said. "Already did," Harris replied. His voice was steady, but his hands were not. For the first time in 32 years, they were trembling slightly. Not from fear exactly, more from the strange, cold feeling of being very good at something and still not knowing what to do. Then the stall warning alarm began to sound. A sharp, repeating tone that every pilot is trained to treat as the most serious alert in aviation. The aircraft dropped another 100 feet in a single breath. In row 16, Emma felt the drop before she heard any alarm. She felt it in her stomach, in the change of pressure in her ears, in the way the floor tilted almost imperceptibly beneath her feet. She had studied enough about aircraft to know the difference between normal turbulence and a structural descent. This was a structural descent. She put down her chart. She looked at her mother. Sarah's knuckles were white on the armrest. Around them, other passengers were beginning to panic in earnest now, clutching loved ones, closing their eyes, praying in whispers. "Mom," Emma said quietly, "this is not turbulence." Sarah looked at her. "I know, baby." Emma unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. A flight attendant named Marie was bracing herself against the galley wall near the front of the aircraft when she noticed the small girl moving through the aisle. In the middle of a cabin full of terrified adults, this child was walking with a calm and purpose that felt completely out of place, and completely impossible to ignore. "Sweetheart, you need to sit down and buckle up," Marie said, reaching out to stop her gently. "I need to get to the cockpit," Emma said. She did not say it rudely. She said it the way you say something when you know it is true. "The cockpit is locked. No passengers are allowed. The pilots have lost both hydraulic relays," Emma said, her voice low and steady. "They are probably running both navigation systems through a single power bus right now, which means they are getting ghost feedback and they do not know which readings to trust. I know how to fix it. Please let me through." Marie stared at her. The plane dropped again, another small, terrifying lurch. Somewhere in the cabin, a baby began to cry. Marie stepped aside. Nobody could later explain exactly how the cockpit door opened. The official investigation would note that the electronic locking mechanism had likely failed along with the rest of the electrical systems, leaving the door on manual release. Whatever the reason, when Emma pushed it, it opened. She stepped inside. Keller heard the door and spun around in his seat. His face went from shock to anger in less than a second. "What, kid, you cannot be in here. Get back to your seat right now." Emma did not flinch. She walked straight to the center console between the two pilot seats and looked at the instrument panel with the focused eyes of someone reading a familiar book. Her gaze moved quickly across the warning lights, the dead screens, the frozen readouts. Her mind was already working. "Your flight control relay is down," she said. "You are running both navigation systems through a single power bus. That is why you are getting bad readings. The dual interface is creating ghost feedback. The system is reading itself in a loop and giving you numbers that are not real." Captain Harris turned slowly in his seat. He looked at the girl standing behind him, small, 9 years old, holding a laminated flight chart rolled loosely in her left hand, and he felt something he had not felt in the cockpit for many years. He felt genuinely lost. "What?" he said. "Bypass your primary circuit using the auxiliary on panel 2, Emma continued, pointing to a section of the console to Harris's left. "Then reset the trim manually. The trim is not responding because it is caught in that same feedback loop. Once you break the loop, you will get real inputs again." Keller looked at Harris. His expression was somewhere between disbelief and desperation. "She's not wrong," he said quietly. Harris was silent for a moment. Every part of him that had 32 years of aviation experience behind it was telling him that this made no sense. And every part of him that was staring at a dark instrument panel, a descending altimeter, and no other options was telling him to listen. He flipped the auxiliary breaker on panel 2. The panel gave a soft buzz. 2 screens flickered. The navigation display glitched, and then, for 3 full seconds, came back to life. Numbers appeared. Real numbers. The trim system gave a faint vibration through the control stick. "That's it," Keller said, his voice rising. "We've got partial input." And then the screens went dark again. But the trim stick still had feeling in it. A tiny amount of resistance, enough to steer with, if you were very careful, and if you knew exactly what you were doing. "Where did you learn this?" "I read flight manuals for fun." "All of them?" Harris and Emma, cockpit of Flight 93B. Emma climbed into the jump seat behind Keller. It was a small, fold-down seat designed for crew members, and it was too big for her, but she sat in it as if she had sat there 100 times before. She pulled her knees together and leaned slightly forward, looking at the instruments that were still working. "You are feeding too much power through the APU," she said, referring to the aircraft's auxiliary power unit, the onboard generator that was now the plane's only remaining source of electricity. "The cabin systems are pulling too much load. Entertainment screens, lighting, pressure sensors, you are running all of it at the same time, and it is pulling power away from the flight controls. You need to shut the cabin systems down completely. Harris hesitated. Cutting cabin power would mean total darkness in the passenger section. It would mean turning off the screens, the overhead lights, and several of the comfort systems that were keeping 94 already frightened people calm. It was a decision that felt wrong in his gut. But Keller had already done the math in his head, and he knew the girl was right. "She's right, Captain," he said. "We need everyone on the flight controls." Harris nodded once. Keller hit the emergency override switch. In the cabin, the lights died. The seatback screens went black. The hum of the air conditioning softened. For one long, terrible second, the entire passenger cabin was dark and silent. Then the emergency floor lights clicked on, small, dim strips running along the base of each row, and the cabin was lit in a pale, eerie glow. A wave of gasps and quiet crying moved through the passengers. Sarah Caldwell gripped both armrests and stared at the closed cockpit door, trying to breathe. But inside the cockpit, the effect was immediate. The remaining instruments steadied. The altimeter, which had been giving unstable readings, now showed a clear and consistent number, 12,400 feet. They were still descending, but the rate had slowed significantly. They had, for the first time since the crisis began, some measure of control. "Good," Emma said. "Now. Nearest emergency landing option." Keller reached for the paper navigation map stored in a side pocket of his seat, the old-fashioned backups that every commercial aircraft carries but almost never uses. He opened the regional chart for the Rocky Mountain corridor and began searching. Emma was faster. "You passed Buffalo Ridge Emergency Field about 12 miles ago," she said. "But there is a decommissioned airstrip 6 miles to your east-northeast. It is listed as inactive, but it is still registered as a legal emergency landing site with the FAA. Runway length is approximately 4,000 feet. It is tight for a 737, but it is doable if you approach slow, come in low, and flare correctly." Both men stared at her. "How do you know the runway length of a decommissioned airstrip in the middle of the Rockies?" Harris asked. "I memorize airport and airfield data," Emma said. "All public airfields in the continental U.S. I do it the same way some people memorize sports scores." Keller let out a breath that was half laugh and half sob. "She's not real." "She's better than anything we've got right now," Harris said quietly. He looked at Emma directly for the first time since she had entered. "Let's find that field." The aircraft was at 10,500 feet. The mountains were closer now, filling the windscreen with dark ridgelines and dense forest. Wind shear near the peaks was beginning to rock the wings. Harris gripped the control stick harder, feeling the limited but real feedback that the trim system was giving him. "Bring the nose up 2 degrees, Emma said from behind him. Her voice was the calmest thing in the cockpit. "Keep the flaps at 5 until you are below 7,000 feet. You need to bleed your speed down slowly or you risk a stall on the approach." Harris followed her instructions. The nose came up slightly. The rate of descent eased. "Good," she said. "Hold that attitude. When you get below 7,000, extend flaps to 15. I will tell you when." Keller was watching the altimeter. 9,000 feet. 8,500. 8,000. The mountains were very close now. Through the rain-spotted windscreen, Harris could see the dark outlines of pine-covered ridges on both sides. The aircraft was threading a valley, and it was getting narrower. "There," Keller said suddenly, pointing to a pale gray rectangle in the valley floor below and to the right. "That's the strip." It was barely visible in the fading evening light. No runway lights. No markings. Just a long, pale strip of cracked concrete carved out of the landscape, surrounded on 3 sides by dense forest and on the 4th by a low hillside. It looked very small from up here. It was the most beautiful thing Harris had ever seen. In the cabin, the flight attendants had moved through every row, quickly and quietly, checking that every seatbelt was tightly fastened and that every passenger was in the correct brace position, head down, hands behind the neck, feet flat on the floor. They did not explain what was happening. There was nothing useful they could say. They just moved, row by row, with steady hands and calm voices, doing the only thing they could do. Sarah Caldwell had her eyes fixed on the thin strip of light visible beneath the cockpit door. She had not moved since Emma had walked through it. Another flight attendant, a young man named David, had stayed beside her, his hand resting lightly on the armrest next to hers. "She is helping them?" Sarah asked him. Her voice was barely audible. "Yes," David said. He had spoken to Marie. He knew what Emma had said at the cockpit door. He still barely believed it. They are listening to her. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand and closed her eyes. Her child. Her 9-year-old daughter. In a broken cockpit, guiding 2 veteran pilots through a mountain landing with no instruments and no runway lights. She did not know whether to feel terrified or proud. She felt both, completely, at the same time. Inside the cockpit, the altitude was now 6,400 feet. The landing strip was dead ahead, 3 miles out. The wind had picked up sharply as they descended into the valley, and it was coming from the left, a crosswind that was pushing the aircraft sideways on its approach. 7,000 feet, Emma said. "Extend flaps to 15 now." Keller extended the flaps. The aircraft slowed. The nose dropped slightly. Harris corrected with gentle backward pressure on the stick. "Speed?" Keller asked. 162, Harris replied, reading from the one airspeed indicator that was still functioning. "Drop to 145, Emma said immediately. "If you arrive any faster than that, you will not be able to stop in 4,000 feet. This runway has no arresting gear. What stops you is your brakes and reverse thrust alone. You need to give yourself every foot of runway you can." "Pulling power back," Harris said. The engines quieted. The speed began to bleed off. The ground was coming up fast, forest, then open scrubland, then the leading edge of the concrete strip. "Crosswind is pushing you left," Emma said. "Compensate with right rudder. Not too much, the runway has a slight slope on the right side. You want to land center left and let the slope work with you, not against you." Harris pressed the right rudder pedal with careful, measured pressure. The aircraft straightened. "Gear down," Emma said. Harris reached for the landing gear lever and pushed it down. A deep mechanical groan passed through the entire aircraft, a sound that every passenger in the cabin heard and felt in their chests. Then 3 heavy thuds, one after another, as each gear locked into position. "Gear confirmed down and locked," Keller said, reading from the gear indicator light, one of the few panel lights still working. 500 feet, Emma said. "Start your flare now. Bring the nose up smoothly, do not jerk it. You want a 3-degree nose-up attitude. Hold it. Hold it." Harris pulled back on the stick, gently, steadily. The nose of the aircraft lifted. The descent rate slowed. The runway filled the entire windscreen now, cracked gray concrete rushing toward them at 145 miles per hour, edged on both sides by dark trees that seemed impossibly close. "Hold," Emma said quietly. "Hold. Hold." The rear wheels touched the runway. There was a sharp screech of rubber, a jolt that passed through the entire aircraft, and then the nose gear came down with a heavy, crashing thud. The aircraft shook violently as the concrete, old, uneven, and scarred, hammered the undercarriage. Harris applied full reverse thrust and stood on the brakes. The cabin filled with a roaring, grinding noise. Passengers screamed and gripped whatever they could reach. Overhead compartments rattled. The cabin shuddered like something alive. And then, slowly, the roaring faded. The shaking eased. The speed dropped. The noise wound down into silence. The aircraft rolled to a stop on the very last few feet of the runway. Beyond the nose of the plane, just barely visible in the fading light, was the edge of the forest, dark trees standing close and still, less than 30 feet from where the plane came to rest. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The engine spooled down. Rain tapped quietly against the fuselage. Inside the cabin, 94 people sat in the dim emergency lighting and breathed. Then a baby cried softly at the back of the aircraft. And then the cabin erupted. Not in panic, in relief. People sobbed. People cheered. A man near the middle of the cabin pressed his forehead against the seat back in front of him and shook with tears. Two strangers who had never met grabbed each other's hands. An elderly woman closed her eyes and whispered something that was not in English. The flight attendants, who had kept their composure through the entire ordeal, finally let themselves cry. It wasn't just a landing. It was survival, raw, unexpected, and against every known rule of aviation. FAA Incident Report, Flight 93B. In the cockpit, nobody moved for almost a full minute. Captain Harris sat with his forehead resting against the top of the control column, his eyes closed, his hands still wrapped loosely around the stick. Keller sat back in his seat and stared at the dark instrument panel in front of him without seeing it. The altimeter had frozen at 0. Outside the windscreen, rain was beginning to fall properly now, streaking the glass in long, thin lines. Behind them, in the jump seat, Emma Caldwell sat with her hands folded in her lap. The laminated flight chart was still rolled in her fingers. For the first time since she had walked into the cockpit, she felt the weight of what had just happened pressing down on her, not fear, exactly, but something heavier and quieter. A kind of fullness that she did not have a word for yet. Harris turned around slowly. His eyes were wet. He looked at her the way you look at something you do not fully understand but know you will never forget. "You did it," he said. "You did it," Emma replied. Her voice, which had been completely steady for the past 40 minutes, wavered slightly on those 3 words. "I just told you where to look." Harris shook his head slowly. He could not find anything else to say. Keller looked at her over his shoulder, and there were no words from him either. Some moments are too large for language. Emergency responders began arriving 12 minutes later. Volunteer firefighters from a small town 15 miles away had picked up a weak emergency frequency ping from the aircraft's backup transmitter, a single, faint signal that had somehow pushed through before the electrical systems fully died. They had driven toward the signal expecting to find wreckage. They found, instead, a full-sized passenger jet sitting upright on a cracked rural airstrip, its lights off, its engines cold, and every one of its 94 passengers alive. The forward door opened. Passengers filed out into the rain, stepping carefully down the emergency slides and then standing on the wet tarmac, looking around at the dark trees and the mountains and the darkening sky as if seeing the world for the first time. One man dropped to his knees on the ground. Another pressed his palms together and looked upward. People embraced strangers. A flight attendant sat down on the edge of the tarmac and simply wept. Sarah Caldwell was one of the first passengers off the aircraft. She moved against the flow of people, pushing forward to the door, searching. And then she saw Emma stepping out behind the 2 pilots, small and calm amid the chaos, still holding her flight chart. Sarah ran. She grabbed her daughter and pulled her close and held her with the strength of someone who had just spent 40 minutes believing she might never hold her again. She did not say anything. She just held on. "We're okay, Mom," Emma said into her shoulder. Her voice was steady and soft. "We're okay." By the following morning, the story was everywhere. Every news channel, every website, every radio station in the country was running the same headline in different words: a commercial aircraft with total instrument failure had made an emergency landing on an abandoned rural airstrip, in the dark, in the rain, in the mountains, and every single person on board had survived. That alone would have been a remarkable story. But it was the second part of the story that made the world stop. A 9-year-old girl had been in the cockpit. She had diagnosed the electrical fault. She had guided the pilots through the fix. She had identified the landing strip from memory. She had directed the approach, the flare, and the touchdown, step by step, in a calm voice, while the mountains came up around them in the dark. The FAA launched an immediate investigation. Air traffic control confirmed that Flight 93B had vanished from radar at 18,000 feet and had not reappeared. No distress call had been received. No transponder signal had been logged. By every technical measure, the aircraft had simply ceased to exist, right up until a volunteer fire team reported finding it intact on a decommissioned strip in a valley that was not on any active flight path. Investigators interviewed the entire crew. They interviewed passengers. They studied the damaged aircraft systems, the maintenance logs, the cockpit voice recorder data. And when they had gathered everything they could, they came to a conclusion that aviation experts found almost impossible to accept: the technical guidance that had saved the flight had been accurate, correct, and, given the specific combination of failures on that aircraft that night, had been the only approach that could have worked. In his official incident report, Captain Douglas Harris wrote one line under the section marked "Unusual Crew Assistance." He wrote it carefully, in the precise language of official aviation documentation, and then he put down his pen. The line read, "Aircraft survived due to technical guidance provided by passenger Emma Caldwell, age 9. Without her intervention, loss of all lives is certain. 94. Lives saved. 0. Injuries reported. 4,000 feet. Runway length. 30 feet. From forest edge." The media storm that followed was unlike anything Emma had imagined or wanted. Her photo appeared on the front page of every major newspaper. Television crews parked outside the Caldwell family home in Seattle. Interview requests arrived from news programs, aviation organizations, schools, and universities. A children's book publisher wrote to Sarah Caldwell offering a deal within 48 hours of the story breaking. 2 Hollywood studios reached out within a week. Emma declined all of it. She was not being modest in a performed way. She genuinely did not want the attention. What she had done on Flight 93B had not felt, to her, like something that deserved celebration. It had felt like a problem that needed solving, and she had solved it. She did not understand why that made her famous, because to her, it was simply what you did when you knew something useful and people needed help. She went back to her room. She opened her laptop. She pulled up a new flight simulator program she had been waiting to try, and she ran through emergency landing scenarios in mountainous terrain for 3 hours, because she had noticed during the real event that she had been slightly uncertain about the optimal flap setting at low altitude, and she wanted to correct that gap in her knowledge before it mattered again. Sarah watched her from the doorway for a moment without speaking. Then she quietly closed the door and went to make dinner. A month after the landing, the airline held a private ceremony at a hotel in Seattle. Every pilot, flight attendant, and passenger from Flight 93B was invited. Almost all of them came. They sat in a large, warmly lit room and shared a meal and, when the speeches were finished, they gave Emma a silver aviation medal, a distinction that had never before been awarded to a civilian and certainly never to a child. The president of the airline knelt down beside her to pin it to her jacket. He looked at her for a moment before he spoke. "We may never fully understand what happened that night," he said. "Or how you stayed so calm. But I want you to know that every person in this room owes you their life. And we will never fly again without thinking of you." Emma looked at the medal. Then she looked at him. "I did not do it alone," she said. "Captain Harris and Officer Keller trusted me. That is the only reason it worked. Without their trust, none of my knowledge meant anything." The room was very quiet when she said it. 47 adults who had been terrified out of their minds on that aircraft sat in silence and felt, in a way they could not quite explain, that this 9-year-old girl had just said something that was more true and more important than anything in any speech they had ever heard. Someone had to believe there was still a way. So I believed it. Emma Caldwell, age 9. Captain Douglas Harris retired from commercial flying 3 months after Flight 93B. He was 58 years old and had more than enough years to justify it, but that was not really why he stopped. He stopped because of something he had felt in the cockpit that night, not fear, and not shame, but a kind of quiet humility that had settled into him and would not leave. He had spent 32 years believing, reasonably and accurately, that he knew what he was doing. He had trained for thousands of hours. He had flown through bad weather, mechanical failures, and emergencies that would have broken a lesser pilot. He was good at his job. He knew it. And then a child had walked into his cockpit and known more than him. Not more in general, more about that specific problem, in that specific moment. She had seen something in the instruments that his experience had trained him not to look for. She had thought about the problem differently. And because of that, 94 people were alive. He told a reporter who reached him for comment, "I spent 30 years thinking that experience was the most important thing a person could have. That night, a little girl taught me that curiosity is more important." She had studied that aircraft not because she had to, but because she wanted to. And when it mattered, she had everything she needed. I had my experience. She had her love for what she was doing. Her love saved us. First Officer Ryan Keller continued flying. He went on to become a captain himself, and he is known among his crew members for one specific habit: whenever a junior crew member, a flight attendant, or even a ground crew worker raises a concern or offers an observation about something on the aircraft, Keller always stops and listens. Fully. He never dismisses. He never waves it off. He always stops and listens. When a colleague once asked him why he was so careful about that, Keller was quiet for a moment. Then he said, simply, "Because once, the most important voice in my cockpit belonged to the last person I expected. I will not make the mistake of not listening again." The 94 passengers of Flight 93B went home to their lives. Most of them never spoke publicly about what had happened. But nearly all of them described, in private, the same shift in how they moved through the world afterward. Small things felt larger. Ordinary mornings felt like gifts. Time with people they loved felt different, more present, more deliberate, less taken for granted. Several of them, in the weeks after the flight, wrote letters. Not to the airline, not to the media. To Emma. The letters were different in style and tone, written by people of different ages and backgrounds, but they all said some version of the same thing: "Thank you for refusing to give up when the adults around you already had." Emma read every one. She kept them in a folder on her bookshelf, between her Boeing maintenance manual and her FAA emergency procedures guide. Months after Flight 93B, a journalist asked Emma a question during the one interview she agreed to give, a short, written interview for an aviation magazine, which she accepted only because she felt it was a publication that would understand the technical side of what had happened without turning it into something dramatic. The journalist asked, "Were you scared?" Emma thought about this for a long time before she answered. Not because she did not know the answer, but because she wanted to be honest, and the honest answer was complicated. "Yes," she finally wrote. "But being scared does not mean you stop thinking. I was scared and I was also working. I do not think those two things are opposites. I think sometimes being scared is what makes you think more carefully, because you understand what the cost of a mistake is." The journalist followed up, "How did you stay calm enough to help?" Emma's answer was short and direct, in the way that her answers always were when she was being completely sincere. "I focused on what I knew. I could not control the aircraft failing. I could not control the weather or the mountains or the darkness. But I knew the systems. I knew the switches. I knew the runway length and the approach angle and the flap settings. I focused on what I knew, and everything else had to wait." She paused before sending the final part of her answer. Then she added one more line, which the magazine printed exactly as she wrote it, without editing. "I was not sure we would make it. I was never completely sure. But I had to try. Giving up when you still have knowledge and you still have time is not something I was willing to do. Not for me, and not for the 93 other people on that plane who had not given up either. That sentence became the most shared line of text in aviation circles for the following year. It was printed on a banner at an aviation safety conference. It was quoted in 3 separate university lectures on emergency decision-making. A pilot training academy in Texas put it on the wall of their emergency procedures classroom. But Emma did not know any of that. She had gone back to her room, back to her laptop, back to her manuals and her simulations and her quiet, unending love for the machines that carry people through the sky. She was 9 years old. She had already saved 94 lives. And she was already studying, in careful and patient detail, how to do it better next time. Because someone had to believe there was still a way. Emma Caldwell, age 9.